Somewhere inside a French courtroom, a Microsoft lawyer said something out loud that no government wants to hear about the company running its entire digital life, and that single admission is the real reason that 2.5 million computers across France are being ripped off Windows right now, starting today, whether Microsoft likes it or not. And I promise you, the headline you've probably seen about this story is not even close to the real one. Because on the surface, this looks like a simple operating system swap, the kind of dry government IT footnote that shows up in a tech newsletter and gets forgotten by lunchtime. But underneath it is a story about a country quietly discovering it may have handed the keys to its own government over to a foreign legal system, and then spending the next 2 years building an escape hatch nobody thought was possible at this scale. On April 8, 2026, France's Interministerial Digital Directorate, the government body known as DINUM that runs the country's entire digital backbone, sent a directive to every single ministry in France. And the instruction was blunt: submit a real working plan by autumn to move every workstation off Microsoft Windows and onto Linux. And don't stop there, because Teams, antivirus platforms, cloud storage, databases, even the AI tools creeping into government offices were named specifically as things to remove, all filed under a phrase officials kept repeating like a mantra: digital sovereignty. France's own Minister for Public Accounts, David Amiel, said it without softening a single word: digital sovereignty is not optional. The country has to take back control of its own digital destiny. And when a sitting minister says something that directly to a room full of journalists, you should probably stop and ask what actually scared them into saying it, because governments don't usually talk like people watching a fire spread. And here's where most of the coverage on this completely missed the real shape of the story. Because this wasn't some sudden ideological lightning bolt that struck DINUM out of nowhere in April. This was the third move in a sequence that had been building quietly for over a year. And once you see the sequence, the whole thing stops looking like a policy announcement and starts looking like a slow, deliberate siege. Back in January 2026, France had already ordered Microsoft Teams and Zoom replaced across those same 2.5 million workers with Visio, a homegrown open-source video platform, deadline 2027, no negotiation. Before that, whole regions had already been quietly testing whether any of this was even survivable. Occitanie, a region of over 6 million people, walked away from Microsoft entirely back in 2023 after watching their contract costs spike, and nobody in Paris was paying much attention. Lyon did it. Marseille did it. Small fires spreading in the dark long before the country noticed the whole forest was catching. And by the time the April directive landed, it wasn't a pivot. It was a conclusion. The final page of a plan that had already been quietly proving itself in the provinces for 3 years. Now here's the part where you need to understand exactly why this is happening in 2026 specifically, and not 5 years ago or 5 years from now, because the timing is not an accident. And once you see the full picture, it stops being a story about software and becomes a story about fear. Trump's reignited tariffs in April of 2025 sent a genuine shockwave through Europe's entire relationship with American technology, and European cloud companies like OVH and Scaleway started reporting record growth almost overnight, as institutions quietly started looking for anywhere else to put their data. But underneath the tariffs, underneath the politics, there was one specific, cold, technical detail that changed everything, and it came directly from Microsoft's own legal team during proceedings in European court, when their lawyers admitted, on record, that they could not guarantee protection of Europeans' government data from American government access requests, specifically because of a law called the Cloud Act, a law that lets the United States government compel American companies to hand over data no matter where in the world that data physically lives. Sit with that for 1 second, because that is not a licensing dispute. That is not a pricing complaint. That is a government realizing that the software running its hospitals, its police stations, its finance ministry could legally be forced open by a foreign power, and the company running that software wouldn't even promise otherwise. That is the real trigger sitting underneath this entire migration, and it's exactly why this attempt feels different from every clumsy government Linux experiment that came before it. Because those were driven by cost, and this one is driven by fear, and fear moves governments in a way spreadsheets never do. But fear alone doesn't build 2.5 million working computers, and this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. Because France isn't walking into this blind. France has something no other government attempting this at scale has ever had. 17 years of quiet, undeniable proof sitting inside its own national police force. The Gendarmerie, the branch of the French military policing huge parts of the country, started down this road back in 2004, and they didn't do anything dramatic. They didn't rip out windows. For overnight, they simply introduced Firefox and OpenOffice into police stations first, and let officers get comfortable before touching anything underneath. And that patience turned out to be the entire secret nobody else figured out. By 2008, the foundation was solid enough that the Gendarmerie built their own Ubuntu-based system called GendBuntu, and by June of 2024, that system was running on 103,164 workstations, 97% of the entire force's computers, which means for well over a decade, one of France's most sensitive law enforcement bodies has been running its daily operations, its case files, its investigations on Linux without collapsing, without a scandal, without anyone in Paris even noticing it was happening. And the financial numbers behind that quiet success are the kind of numbers that should genuinely frighten Microsoft's board, because the Gendarmerie saves roughly 2 million euros every single year in licensing costs alone, and total cost of ownership across their entire computing infrastructure dropped by an estimated 40%, and that figure isn't just what they stopped paying Microsoft. It's lower support costs, more predictable maintenance, and sensitive police data that never has to touch infrastructure France doesn't fully control. There's a detail buried in their procurement process that I think tells you everything about how mature this operation actually is. Because roughly 90% of the 10,000 computers the Gendarmerie buys every year arrive with no operating system installed at all. They strip the Windows license out of the purchase entirely and install GendBuntu themselves in-house, which means this isn't a government office fumbling through an unfamiliar transition. This is a self-sufficient technical operation that has spent 17 years quietly building exactly the expertise the entire country now needs. And DINUM knows it because in February 2026, before the broader directive even landed, DINUM openly cited the Gendarmerie as the governance model for the entire national rollout. Read that again because that is the government admitting, on the record, that it isn't inventing this migration from scratch. It is taking a battle-tested 17-year success story built inside a police force and scaling its exact methodology up to every ministry in the country. And multiple officials have floated using GendBuntu itself, or something built on the same foundation, as the actual operating system for the whole civil service, which means 2.5 million civil servants aren't stepping into unknown territory. They're joining an ecosystem where 600,000 colleagues already use the government's own secure messaging platform, where over 100,000 police officers already boot into Ubuntu every single morning without a second thought, and where a working playbook for procurement, training, and support already exists inside French borders, instead of needing to be built from zero under pressure. And France isn't even acting entirely alone here, because Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein started its own transition back in 2023, and by early 2026 had completed nearly 80% of a 30,000 workstation migration, recording $15 million in savings in 2026 alone. Though it's worth being precise that a meaningful chunk of that number comes from the switch to LibreOffice specifically, rather than the operating system change, which is still actively underway. In February 2026, Schleswig-Holstein became the first regional government anywhere in the world to formally endorse the United Nations open source principles, which gives this entire movement something it never had before, an actual international policy framework instead of a scattered pile of disconnected national experiments. And their full migration is targeted for 2030, with pilots starting in the second half of 2026, tracking almost exactly the same calendar France has set for itself. But here's where I have to slow down and be honest with you, because it would be dishonest to sell you this story as a guaranteed victory without confronting the graveyard sitting directly behind it. And that graveyard has one name that comes up in absolutely every serious piece of writing on this subject: Munich. In the early 2000s, the city of Munich attempted almost exactly what France is attempting right now, migrating 12,600 government desktops onto their own custom Linux system called LiMux. By 2012, the city was standing on stage, internationally declaring victory, holding itself up as living proof that a major Western government could genuinely break free of Windows. Then something happened that had nothing to do with technology at all. Political leadership changed hands. Opposition that had been quietly simmering the entire time suddenly gained real institutional power, and the whole project got unwound, slowly, methodically, piece by piece. Until by 2020, Munich was fully back on Windows, and one of the most celebrated government Linux success stories on the planet had quietly become one of the most cited cautionary tales instead. And that is the exact pattern that shows up across nearly every failed European Linux migration in history. An agency announces bold plans, spends years fighting legacy software compatibility and staff resistance and aggressive vendor lobbying, and then quietly reverses course the moment political momentum fades and a new administration with different priorities walks through the door. And France knows this history intimately, which is precisely why the Gendarmerie's 17 years matters so enormously to how seriously this new directive is being taken right now. France isn't claiming this could theoretically work. France is pointing at over 100,000 working machines inside its own government and saying, we already know this works. The only remaining question is whether it survives the jump from 100,000 disciplined police officers to 2.5 million civil servants scattered across every ministry in the country. And that question, more than any other, is exactly what should keep you watching this story unfold over the next several years. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where the story stops being an interesting policy experiment happening quietly in Europe and becomes a direct, quantifiable threat sitting on Microsoft's own balance sheet. Starting in July 2026, Microsoft raised the price of its Microsoft 365 plans by up to 16.7%, and the timing could not have landed worse for them, because France's own Ministry of Public Accounts pointed directly at that exact price increase as part of the justification for building a domestic software stack, and the French government is projecting savings of more than 15 million euros in licensing fees alone, and that number is before the operating system migration itself is even factored in. Analysts covering the full 2.5 million device transition estimate the total cost could run anywhere from 1.5 billion to 3 billion euros across a 5 to 7 year rollout, once you account for hardware upgrades, software development, staff retraining, and building support infrastructure at national scale. And that is a genuinely staggering upfront number. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but weigh that. One-time cost against a Microsoft relationship that just became structurally more expensive indefinitely for an organization with 2.5 million seats. And the long-term math starts looking very different from a simple government dislikes big tech headline. This is a government running the exact same cost-benefit calculation any major enterprise would run, and concluding that a few painful years of transition are worth permanently escaping a recurring cost structure that keeps moving in the wrong direction. And here's the piece of this that should genuinely worry Microsoft's enterprise sales division far more than the raw euro figures do. Because a 2.5 million device migration eliminates one of the single largest Windows Enterprise contracts anywhere in Europe. The kind of steady, almost boring recurring revenue that has quietly underwritten a massive chunk of Microsoft's enterprise business for decades, without ever showing up in a flashy earnings headline, and that reliability is now genuinely in question in a way analysts say it hasn't been since the earliest open source experiments of the 2000s. And France is not doing this in isolation. Germany and Italy have both signaled real interest in following the same path, with discussions reportedly already underway for potential moves in 2027. And if either country commits anywhere near France's scale, the cumulative device count across Europe alone starts entering the tens of millions. And that is not a rounding error on anyone's balance sheet anymore. That is an entire continent quietly renegotiating its relationship with American software. Now, I promised you honesty, and honesty means acknowledging that Munich is not the only reason to stay skeptical here, because experts who have actually studied large-scale government migrations point to challenges that even the Gendarmerie's success story doesn't fully answer. And the core issue is simple. A disciplined national police force and a sprawling decentralized civil service are fundamentally different organisms to migrate. France's civil service depends on thousands of specialized applications, many of them built specifically for Windows environments over literal decades, covering everything from healthcare administration to financial regulation, and open source alternatives simply haven't fully replaced every one of those specialized tools yet. Retraining 2.5 million government workers is a genuinely massive undertaking entirely separate from the technical migration itself, and the short-term productivity cost during that retraining window will be real and measurable, not some hypothetical footnote analysts are inventing to sound cautious. And the scale challenge here deserves to be stated plainly, because France's 2.5 to 2.6 million target represents roughly 25 times the size of the Gendarmerie's own successful migration, and, by some estimates, over 200 times the peak scale Munich ever reached before it collapsed under its own weight. France has proof this works at 100,000 users. It does not yet have proof this works at 2.5 million users spread across dozens of ministries with wildly different technical needs, different legacy dependencies, and critically, different levels of political durability once the next election cycle arrives. And that last point is really the crux of the entire risk sitting inside this story. Munich didn't fail because the technology stopped working. Munich failed because political leadership changed and brought in officials with different priorities, and a project that took a decade to build got unwound in a fraction of that time the moment the coalition sustaining it lost power. And France's current directive has real teeth right now. A hard autumn 2026 deadline, explicit backing from the Ministry of Public Accounts, a coordinated multi-year sequence that clearly isn't stopping with this announcement, but whether that same insulation from ordinary electoral churn holds true across education ministries and finance ministries and dozens of other branches with very different political sensitivities is genuinely an open question that not even DINUM itself can answer with certainty today. And that uncertainty is exactly why the next few years of this story matter infinitely more than the initial announcement did. So let me give you a real framework for judging this yourself, instead of taking either side's press release at face value, because there are 3 specific checkpoints that will tell you everything. First, DINUM itself is converting its own roughly 350 internal systems onto a French Linux distribution before asking anyone else to follow. Which means the people writing the migration playbook are the same people who have to personally live with its consequences first, an incentive alignment that was completely missing from most of the earlier failed European experiments where policy got set by officials who never had to touch the technical fallout themselves. Second, watch the industrial digital meeting scheduled for June 2026, where DINUM intends to formalize public-private coalitions specifically to support this transition, because if those coalitions produce genuine funded partnerships with French and European software vendors, that is a meaningfully more durable foundation than a government simply installing Ubuntu on a few million machines and hoping community goodwill fills in the gaps. And third, and most important of all, watch the pilot deployment phase beginning in the second half of 2026, because full deployment across every agency isn't expected until 2030 at the earliest, which gives France a genuinely long runway to catch the compatibility problems and legacy dependencies and staff resistance that sank Munich, rather than discovering all of it at once during a rushed, forced cutover. But that long runway cuts both ways, because it also means this project has to survive at minimum 1 and likely 2 French presidential election cycles before it reaches completion. And every single European government Linux migration that has previously failed did so, specifically because it lost political momentum partway through, never because the underlying technology stopped functioning. So watch what happens to this directive's funding and priority level after France's next major national election, because that moment, far more than any technical milestone, is historically where these projects actually live or die. And it's worth zooming out here, because whatever happens specifically inside France, something has genuinely shifted in how governments think about their relationship with American technology. And that shift reaches far beyond desktop operating systems. Barcelona, South Korea, and large parts of India's public sector have all made significant parallel moves toward open source infrastructure. In recent years, Austria adopted a formal charter on digital sovereignty in 2025 that was subsequently endorsed by all 27 European Union member states at a summit on European digital sovereignty. And Amsterdam published a multi-year digital autonomy strategy targeting full sovereignty by 2035. None of this is coordinated under one single authority, but together it describes a genuine continental trend rather than one isolated French experiment, and France's willingness to attempt this at full national scale rather than confining it to a single city or region gives the rest of Europe a real large-scale reference point to watch, something none of the smaller efforts before it ever provided. If France's migration is still standing, still funded, and still on schedule in 2028, do not be surprised if Germany and Italy's currently tentative conversations turn into their own formal directives. Because right now, every other European government seriously considering this path is explicitly waiting to see whether France proves it's possible at scale before committing their own political capital to the same fight. And there is one final irony worth sitting with honestly before we close this out, because digital sovereignty at the desktop layer does not automatically solve the deeper problem driving this entire movement. Because even as France replaces Windows with Linux and Teams with Visio, the cloud and compute infrastructure sitting underneath most of Europe's most ambitious technology projects, including a wave of European AI startups recently selected for Amazon's own AWS Pioneers cohort, continues to run predominantly on American cloud infrastructure. Replacing the desktop is the most visible, most politically satisfying layer of this entire fight, but it sits directly on top of a cloud and compute substrate that remains overwhelmingly American-controlled. And if France and its European partners are genuinely serious about full digital sovereignty rather than just the most symbolically pleasing piece of it, the deeper infrastructure layer is the fight that actually determines whether any of this means more than a few million desktop icons changing shape. So here's my honest read after spending days inside the government. Directives, the financial disclosures, and the 17-year history behind this, France has done something no European government has attempted before. taking a genuinely proven internal success story and scaling it to a level of geopolitical urgency created directly by Microsoft's own admitted inability to guarantee data protection from American legal reach. But treating this as a guaranteed success would ignore every real political and technical risk that has sunk every previous attempt at this scale, and the honest truth is nobody, not DINUM, not Microsoft, not a single analyst covering this story, actually knows yet whether France's political will survives contact with the next election cycle. What we do know, right now in the middle of 2026, is that it is working on schedule with real ministries actively building real migration plans instead of quietly shelving them, and whether that is still true in 2028 and whether the rest of Europe follows might be the single biggest open question sitting inside enterprise technology policy today, and I intend to keep watching every checkpoint as it happens, instead of covering the announcement once and moving on. So if stories like this, the ones that live behind the headlines instead of on top of them, are useful to you, stay close, because this one is far from finished. And I want to know what you think. Does France actually pull this off by 2030, or does this become the next Munich? Drop your prediction below. I read every single one.